I just want to share with you four global, what I'm going to call decrescendos, this gradually reducing force or volume or loudness or intensity, because they will have an impact in various ways on all economies, including South Africa. The first one is the decrescendo of America and Western Europe's power, as it were, in the world economy. On the left-hand side, you see, for instance, that the 5 biggest developing economies have a combined output that is bigger than that of the 5 biggest developed economies. The decrescendo here means that America and Europe will not become unimportant, it's just that their peak, as it were, was probably reached 5 or 6 years ago. Then the whole story about globalization, if we have a look at 3 statements made since the beginning of this year. One, very much in support, as you can clearly see, of economic globalization. Then another statement made earlier this year, you can probably recognize straight away who the author probably was. And a few weeks ago, someone said, if you believe you are a citizen of the world, then you're a citizen of nowhere. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is to identify the authors. The third of my 4 decrescendos is the working age population of the West is declining. Or, as we also know, we are witnessing rapid aging of populations. And this is creating all kinds of challenges, economic, but also, of course, social and political. According to the World Bank, this aging has another implication. They reckon that in the G20 countries, over the last few years, total factor productivity growth, that's the green bar, has been into negative territory. And they find a link between that and the red line, which shows us the proportion of a workforce that consists of elderly workers. The fourth and final one is, in a certain sense, for some people, a solution for this one, and for others, a major concern. And that is the decrescendo of labor as a production factor. Or put differently, the so-called 4th Industrial Revolution. Or put even differently, the robots are coming. This is changing the world, obviously, the world of work, the world of concern. Many people fear this, others welcome it, others embrace it, others can't wait for it. And the big question, or many questions, one of them is, what will happen to us as human beings as potential workers or as not potential workers? Whatever the outcome is, and there are many possible outcomes, all of this is suggesting that for the next number of years, economic growth will be somewhat lower, not negative, but lower than what we had become accustomed to before the so-called Great Recession. So not no growth, but more mediocre growth. Although one might argue that this moderation is not necessarily a bad thing. And maybe in a few years' time, people will look back and call our current situation not so much the age of austerity or the age of moderation, but rather an age of consolidation, an age of realism, an age of sustainability. Our challenge is arguably to reach and sustain a growth rate of 5%, but please note, inclusive growth, not any old growth, in a world out there which is becoming more complex and more turbulent. I've taken a metaphor for the rest of my story, because obviously I'm now moving to South Africa. And the metaphor is sometimes a biblical, sometimes a literary reference to 7 deadly sins of human beings. Lust, gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, envy, and hubris. Now, I can't use them exactly in that same fashion. I struggle to find an economic metaphor for lust. So I've got my own selection here. Hubris, gluttony, impatience, ignorance, complacency, entitlement, and fatalism. And I'm going to argue that some of these sentiments, if you like, on the right-hand side, are to blame, at least in part, for our sluggish, disappointing growth rate. So here's my South African economic version of hubris or pride. Just 2 statements we often hear. We are the gateway into Africa. So we are big and strong and powerful. The world loves us. The world wants to invest here because we are the most important. We are the big brother of Africa. The reality is that we are no longer the biggest economy. At best, We are second biggest, at least in sub-Saharan Africa, after Nigeria. If we look at the whole continent, we have to add the fact that Egypt has a slightly bigger economy than South Africa. If we look at global competitiveness, we are no longer the most competitive country. We're still there and thereabouts, but Mauritius now has that privilege. That puts us more or less at the same level of competitiveness as Russia, Italy, Portugal, and better than Mexico. The second statement we often hear, or have heard in the last few months, and it was also referred to by an earlier speaker, is that we've got this junk bond status, but who cares? The reality is, according to the World Bank, if we were to be given this downgrade end of last year, in other words, beginning of this year, then at the very minimum, short-term interest rates could rise by 60 basis points, or at least stay where they are for longer than we had hoped. 1% disappears from our GDP. Now, 1%, if you say quickly, doesn't sound all that much, but it could be the difference between a bit of growth and no growth. So junk bond status does matter. I fear that we're sometimes also guilty of gluttony or greed. And again, I'm taking poetic license here. If we look at, and this links to the previous point, things like government debt. The point was made a bit earlier. Government debt here has risen from barely 26% of the GDP to just over 50%. And we can't only look at government and blame them for this gluttony or greed. If we have a look, for instance, at the red line, that's private credit growth. Despite high interest rates, still growing at times, and not too distant past, at 10%. In fact, the fact that it's growing is actually indicative of the point here. So maybe this has unfortunately become many people's mantra. I shop, therefore I am. Then I suspect that we are also guilty, and again, this point was alluded to slightly differently a little bit earlier, of a strong dose of impatience. As was quite rightly pointed out, we've had a series of, let's call it economic plans or strategies, the RDP, GEAR, ASGISA, 9-point plans, GIPSA, national this, national that. But most of them have been, at best, 5-year plans. There's not much you can do in 5 years. You cannot undo all the incorrect and inappropriate measures taken in the past within 5 years. We do have a slightly longer plan, for the first time ever, National Development Plan, or Vision 2030. Now, that was 2011, so it was roughly a 20-year plan. And we all might recall the basic concerns raised in those initial documents. Poor educational outcomes, crumbling infrastructure, public service performance is uneven, corruption, high disease burden, economy too resource intensive, etc., etc. We know this with some very noble objectives. Unemployment to halve from 25% to 14%, and then again down to 6% by 2030. GDP to increase, the whole GDP, by a factor of almost 3. Per capita GDP from 50,000 to double that. Export volumes growing. National savings rate, which is now around about 16%, rising to 25%. Investment rising from 17% to 30% of GDP. I think it's important to realize that these are all interdependent. You can't get better growth unless many of these other things happen. Then, if I quote the sometimes controversial Saint-Peter Blanche, he says, the exercise is valueless if the targets are compiled without articulating institutional changes that are required. The fourth one is, I think in many ways we are ignorant, that's not stupid, ignorant about the world reality, or we have misconceptions about that world reality. I'm constantly surprised about how many South Africans do not realize that out of 220 economies, we are the 28th largest. We are not, as many South Africans think, a Mickey Mouse, trivial, unimportant, irrelevant economy. We're one of the biggest in the world. And then another one which I find interesting, if we have a look at an average monthly disposable salary, after-tax salary, the country with the best in the world is Switzerland. South Africa is number 56 out of 176. So there's no way we can say that our average salaries are extremely low. Not only are our wages, well, better than average, unfortunately, our productivity is not better than average. Complacency. We are in what is called a middle income trap. We've been a middle income country for many, many years. The working definition of a middle income trap is being a middle income country for more than 28 years and not yet having succeeded in moving to the next level, which is high income. 28 years. We have been middle income for more than 63 years. Then the much used word entitlement. I don't want to go into the political explanation because I don't know what it is, but as much as we might not agree, no one, including the world out there, actually owes anybody anything. And labor, the labor market's a good example of that. No one owes labor a job. It's something we need to realize. Many people seem to think they're entitled to get a so-called matric certificate, and so to achieve that, let's lower the standards. But ultimately, all that does is create mediocrity. My final one, and I'm not saying this is universal, I'm not saying everyone shares this, the sense of fatalism and hopelessness, but it is disturbing how many people are expecting the country to go from bad to worse. The problem is that could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, the darker bar represents bad. The perception amongst ordinary people is fighting corruption, bad. Narrowing income gaps, bad. All the way down to round about that one. Electricity supply, still bad. And we have to ask the question, are we seeing a democracy for some people without economic emancipation? And is that situation sustainable? If I put it all together, then I started off by saying that our challenge is to achieve a higher growth rate. A few years ago, something called the Growth Commission, a global bit of research, they pointed out that if you really want to reduce poverty and unemployment, countries of our nature, developing, need to grow at 7% a year for 25 years in a row. And our first reaction is probably, oh, don't be silly. That's impossible. They went on to point out that since 1950, this has happened in a number of countries. So if they manage to achieve it, the big question is how? By doing what? And the answer really is just doing the basics right. Globalize. Export what you're good at producing, import what you're not so good at producing. Obviously, creating the right environment, a stable environment, which includes modest inflation and fiscal responsibility. We need more investment in buildings, machinery, etc., to generate future growth. But for that to happen, you need more savings. Savings means having to have a future orientation, thinking about what lies ahead in 20 or 30 years' time, and not immediate gratification. The fourth requirement is market allocation of resources. And the fifth one, and I think the words are very interesting here, good leadership, good governance, not only at a political level, but also at a business level, and no doubt at a civil society level, that it's one thing having good policies, it's another thing having the ability to make these good policies happen. I want to leave you with these two thoughts, or two slides to think about. But I do want to remind us all that we are an upper middle income economy. We're amongst the 30 largest in the world. We do have a widely respected and progressive legal framework and an exceptionally modern and well-respected financial infrastructure. Our economy is diversified. Our monetary policy is generally solid and well thought out. We are the 47th most competitive country in the world. We have a young population, which could be a big asset. And we are also remarkably innovative. So, we need to think about the obstacles and the inefficiencies that are imposed by various state-owned enterprises, the lack of policy coherence, the high regulatory burden, and labor market rigidities. These are constraints to economic growth. And then our agricultural sector needs to be rethought. So, freedom in South Africa, economic freedom in South Africa, yes. We could argue that we are punching below our weight. And I leave you with the thought that we have the freedom to achieve a moment of clarity when we start realizing that we are punching below our weight and not just accept things as they are. We need to question and question why, for instance, we spend more money per capita on education than most countries in Africa, but we are amongst the lowest ranked in terms of outcomes. We spend 9 times more than Zambia, but their ranking in terms of education standards is double ours. We have to question that. Why is that? Why do we tolerate that? When do we start realizing we are punching below our weight? We could be doing so much better.